Thank you for staying with us. The South African Institute of International Affairs will be participating in the UN Summit of the Future. Now, the summit scheduled for next year will focus on empowering youth in Africa, but also helping them shape their future. I am joined now by Dr. Njeri Mwagiru, who's a senior researcher for futures and systematic innovation for the Futures programs at SAIIA. A pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon, Dr. Mwagiru. Firstly, how can foresight competencies indeed empower African youth to become, call it, more proactive in shaping their own futures and those of their communities as well?
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you for this conversation. Foresight competencies can empower African youth because it provides them with tools and methodologies to not only imagine futures, but to think around alternative futures and also to rigorously explore different options for actions, decisions, policies, and strategies to achieve futures they want. So youth can be empowered by foresight by thinking around futures they want to achieve and having the approaches to allow them to take the relevant actions to build and shape those futures.
But can you explain the role of Futures Literacy Laboratory, but also the Three Horizons framework in really helping youth understand and even prepare for different future scenarios?
Yes, those are two methodologies that are quite widely used in the foresight and futures thinking communities. They are among a toolkit or toolbox of multiple approaches, but in particular, the Three Horizons framework and also Futures Literacy Labs give us the tools to reframe futures so that we're not only repeating current models, mechanisms, policy and strategy approaches that work today, but we are really innovating around what the requirements might be for future conditions, for emerging eventualities that would impact the decisions we're taking today. And these approaches allow us to think around the kinds of steps we need to take. What of the current ways of doing things work for us? What current policies and strategies are in service of the futures we want to build? And which of those are not, and which we might need to let go or transform and innovate away from. Then they also allow us to experiment with different approaches, different policy approaches, and to think around what the different outcomes would be from those alternative approaches. And finally, they consistently give us a North Star or a preferred future, a desired outcome that we want to achieve, that we can work towards and also measure our progress in terms of actions towards achieving those futures.
Let's look at the benefits of this. What specific benefits have been observed from using this foresight methodologies in youth-led initiatives across the continent?
I think primarily the methodologies are very participatory and action learning oriented. So key outcomes that we can see immediately, because when we talk about and work in futures and foresight, we're also looking at the long game. So some of the impacts and outcomes will only emerge in the short, medium to long-term future. But immediately, the participatory approaches that we use in these foresight methodologies are combining different networks, allowing different alternative approaches already underway and being implemented in different corners of South Africa, in different African countries and internationally. It allows us to convene different stakeholders, different agents and actors in different fields, from the arts to entrepreneurship, including agriculture or in education and health, and bring these different voices and perspectives together to think around how they can collaborate, what their shared challenges may be, but also what opportunities they might leverage as a collective to achieve the different initiatives and projects and programs they're working on. So the participatory approaches, I believe, are particularly valuable to bringing together different voices across the continent and across different sectors.
Let's talk collaboration now. How do you see this partnership between SAIIA and the AU agency, that's AU APRM, and other international organizations really enhancing the effectiveness, if you will, of youth empowerment programs, especially on the African continent?
We are a collaboration of quite a number of partners that will be convening a side event as part of the United Nations Summit of the Future in New York. And this collaboration is showcasing initiatives that each of these partners have contributed towards. In particular, we want to talk around foresight-driven youth-led initiatives, and the International Development Research Center, the Global Affairs Office in Canada, have been a great supporter of the work of the South African Institute of International Affairs Futures Program, but also the African Union Africa Peer Review Mechanism champion quite a lot of youth-led networks and initiatives across the continent. And we want to offer a platform for these initiatives to be showcased, but also to share some of the learnings that are emerging from this work, and perhaps to learn from others as well, globally and internationally, in terms of how we can enrich these initiatives that aim to foreground foresight, so thinking long-term about what can be possible, but also empower and enable youth agency to be the leaders and drivers of these initiatives and to have ownership of them so that the impacts can be long-term, but also something that is part of their growth and their development.
But what challenges do you face when implementing foresight practices in these youth programs? And how can these challenges be overcome?
I think a key challenge is mindsets and perspectives. So much of the policy environment and the decision makers, specifically at high levels in governments or in international organizations, for instance, in the multilateral system, tend to be short-term oriented or limited perhaps to leadership terms, campaign periods, regime periods, and that can compromise long-term strategy and policy. And what we're really hoping is for a long-term approach to addressing some of the shared challenges that we face, and also to maximizing on the potential that, for instance, African youth offer. And for these long-term strategies to be prioritized across different leadership regimes, across different approaches and policy priorities, so that over the long term, initiatives that we put in place now and priorities that we would like to achieve can be continually worked upon. And some of the ways to address this, we believe, is exposing different stakeholders and decision makers to foresight practice and to futures thinking. We really believe that having the conversations, for instance, around accountability to future generations allows for this change in thinking away from short-term gains to long-term legacy and long-term securing of shared heritage that we can pass on to those that are coming after us.
But how does the intergenerational dialogue featured in the upcoming summit, how does it contribute to more effective youth engagement, but also policy making?
Yeah, we are really hoping that the dialogue will open up thinking around how to actively include youth in decision-making, policy, and strategy mechanisms. And we are very grateful that, for instance, the Action Days are offering a platform for youth-led conversations and for youth stakeholders to hold leaders accountable to this open door to including the youth voice. So we move beyond talking to actually allowing youth to have a table and to drive decision-making in ways that are relevant for needs and the demands that they're facing as a generation, but also thinking around generations to come as well.
And in what ways can African youth networks really leverage foresight competencies to indeed address urgent social and economic issues in their regions?
Primarily, the networks are a platform for African youth to come together. They are a convening forum and avenue. And by using foresight practice, we hope to enable youth to think long-term about the initiatives that they're driving now, so that they're not only focused, for instance, on maybe fundraising or some of the challenges that young and budding initiatives face, but that they can think long-term about the role they can play in systemic transformation, in contributing to large-scale development, and to playing a role through collaborating with others in similar spaces or in sectors where the ecosystem is mutually beneficial, in order for the impacts of these youth initiatives to have much wider reach and scope.
And looking ahead, what future trends or even emerging issues do you believe will be most impactful for youth empowerment efforts in Africa? And how can Foresight then help prepare for these changes?
Yeah, the Africa youth demographic is quite a significant population segment, and key issues, trends that are important to consider are the need for skills development, critical skills development, especially as we anticipate this youth demographic to play quite a substantive role in the international workforce in the coming decades. It's also important to consider the impact of climate change and the environmental shifts that are creating, for instance, extreme weather events and demanding mitigation measures, and the ways in which trends such as the green industrialization and emergence of green economies can be used to ensure that initiatives are sustainable and also have longevity in terms of resilience to some of these challenges. So those are two, but there's quite a few others that we're reflecting on, including, for instance, the issues of governance on the continent, the need to think around succession in terms of political regimes. So yes, there's quite a few that we're looking at.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Njeri Mwagiru, really sharing her insights on building foresight competencies, but also networks to empower youth in Africa. She's been giving us her perspective on this. Moving to Mpumalanga, where the Community Safety MEC in the province is once again appealing to motorists to exercise caution on the road. Now, this is after 5 people lost their lives in the early hours of the morning in a crash on the road between Mkobodzi and Madadeni. Their vehicle overturned and went up in flames. Now, the 6th person was rushed to hospital with critical injuries. The provincial spokesperson for community safety, or rather